is this aspect of the management, but in truth we can't claim that. This bank is steeper, it's pretty south-facing, so the soils are a bit thinner, the microclimate's different, it's a bit drier, so there are other factors as well. But of course the reason that it enables us to look at the different management is because it is steep, and steep enough that you can't drive a tractor up and down. It's certainly not a modern one. And so we've just come down through gates which aren't closed, and most of those gates tend to sit open for a lot of the time, so the livestock wander in and around all these fields, so it is grazed, and in fact, so its grazing is pretty similar to the other fields. It's never cut for silage, so it doesn't get chopped off in May, as the first cut of silage will tend to occur, and if anything though, it actually is more intensively grazed than the previous field, because all year round it gets hammered by rabbits. So one of the things that you tend to think as being the most important factor perhaps in driving down species richness might be a lot of grazing, isn't it? It's one of those things which perhaps I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but until you look at the countryside in a bit more detail, that's what you perhaps tend to think. Put lots of grazing stock on, automatically the species richness will probably go down. Probably what you've done about in lectures has maybe tried to counteract that, and look around your feet here, and in a minute when you have to kneel down on this ground, you will see that in your quadrat there are hopefully a good many species, and even at this early stage in the year you can see that there are certainly some very different plants to those which we've just been looking at. So this site is never reseeded, never fertilised, doesn't have manure spread across it, does have nutrients stripped out of it, interestingly enough, by grazing stock. Obviously they dung a few back in, but they tend to move more out probably than they put in. So there's a slow input of nutrients then from weathering the soil and a bit from rain, but basically it'll be a nutrient poor, and in this part of the world relatively acid sort of grassland, but not a strongly acid soil like you'd see up in the hills or up around Cwmcleta, you know, where we did the woodland, more in that sort of pH 5.5 sort of zone. So sort of acid grassland. Have a look at some of these plants though, and it's easy first of all to spot things like the violets, which obviously stand out at this time of year and a beautiful feature of the site. But actually some of the most important changes of course are in amongst the grasses. You may see some perennial ryegrass still dotted around, seeding into the site, but when you look closely at a lot of these grasses, one of the things that's noticeable is that there are a couple of species of long, fine-leaved grasses. Fine-leaved again to put off the grazers. And you cannot build a big leaf blade if you are relatively slow growing because the nutrients are poor. So we have some fine-leaved grasses.
They're like bristles, okay? They're not like bristles of a brush.
And another important plant is this one, which rather nicely from our point of view is flowering now. And it tends to flower. We actually saw it in flower, I don't know if you can remember, right back to being in the dune grasslands. So it flowers either end of the year, and in between times it becomes quite unnoticeable and often overlooked. The leaves tend to die off a little bit in the middle of the summer actually. But it's little flowers there, it's dwarf. Like lots of these plants are actually small versions. It would naturally hit that sort of height if the rabbits weren't grazing it down. What's the most noticeable thing about it beside the flower? It's got rather leaf-like blades, but have a look at them.
Hairy.
Incredibly hairy, great long fine hairs, again to put off grazers. And that is field woodrush. And it won't tolerate very much by way of cultivation, so it's usually a good sign of what we might think of as an ancient grassland.
So by cultivation you mean like soil disturbance?
Well, you can chop it up with hooves and things like that, as you'll see, and it'll be, because it will reseed fairly successfully and it will reinvade into the local grasslands, but it won't tolerate much turning over and the roots exposing, so ploughing and that sort of thing.
Just skewing the harrows.
Plus, if you up the fertilisers, that'll kill it off because it won't compete with the other species and things like that. So it's a good indicator species of relatively unimproved grasslands, as indeed are the violets that you see all around your feet there. And now we're into that sort of important world really of these banks like this are covered in this mixture of herbs, and in a moment hopefully you'll be able to demonstrate, and you count the forbs in particular, a good large number of them. This is a sort of habitat which is under increasing pressure, and one of the things I dropped into Blackboard to sort of get you thinking really about the assignment was that little news clip from last week from the Wildlife Trust about loss of old grasslands, ancient grasslands. And if you look around here, where are you going to find this sort of grassland? Exactly where it is here on these steeper banks. Don't do anything to them, and a lot of the farmers will basically abandon them. Here the stock just have access because there don't happen to be fences particularly close to the edges of this, so they're wandering across the top. But slowly the gorse comes in, because the gorse obviously is not eaten very readily by the rabbits, so it seeds into the patches of bare ground. It's a nitrogen fixer which gives it its head start, so it gets a competitive advantage. The hawthorn bushes might start to set seed, and the blackthorn in particular will invade out from hedge banks, and so they disappear. So we will lose little patches of grassland like this. Now, it's not that scrub like that gorsey area, or those gorsey banks over there, don't have a value, and of course eventually they may progress onto woodland. And if we were looking at those areas and they were covered in broadleaf woodland, we'd probably celebrate them, wouldn't we, and say, fantastic. And if this was growing oak trees, and just around the corner it's a woodland, and we'd think that's brilliant. But at the same time, it has a lovely value as an ancient grassland. At one time it was worth the effort when people were producing local food for local people with loads of cheap labour. You put the effort into clearing the trees off these banks and you grazed them, because you used everything you could, didn't you, really? Now it's hardly worth the effort, so it could theoretically disappear. If it does, then some of the species will disappear too. The violets are reasonably widely spread and will go into woodlands as well, but the field woodrush and so on will tend to disappear. And the violets and particularly the fine-leaved grasses, the fescues, are important food plants for a number of quite scarce butterflies. So there's a butterfly interest often on these sites, and it's more than that in terms of invertebrates. A very rare sight now are hill ants, yellow meadow ants. So these ant hills are valuable, if you like, for the species that they support in their own right. They actually create a wonderful, we could do a whole separate study on these ant hills. There are different plants growing on the shady side to the sunny side. The ants put fine soil up onto the tops, and you tend to find different species on there. If you get lots of them in the right habitats, then of course you get the blue butterflies who have the mutualistic relationships with ants and so on. That's getting into an even more complicated system. But in more simplistic terms, yellow hill ants support what type of bird in particular? Say again? No, not so. I mean, this sort of turfy ground, short turf, is ideal for skylarks. You're right, if you've got a big flat area, but they don't like steep banks so much. But green woodpeckers are the classic one. Yeah, and unfortunately, this bank isn't big enough to have enough ants on to support enough pairs of green woodpeckers to give you a viable population. They've disappeared over loads of the countryside. They're one of the species of great conservation concern. Ironically, then, if your policy is too much towards promoting woodland and allowing regenerating that, and if you walk on this farm as an agri-environment advisor might do, and speak to the farmer, and the farmer says, well, it's not worth much to me in productivity terms, is there any way I can get even more money out of it? And you say, well, yes, you can make money out of it in agri-environment terms. So what could we do with this land? Well, one temptation might be to stick trees all over it. That always seems like a nice, easy option, doesn't it? And sure, in the end, it will bring a wildlife value of its own right, but it has a very high wildlife value now. How could you improve it? Well, maybe it would improve it to keep the sheep off it. Possibly there's been cattle in here which has poached it up even more and knackered some of these ant hills. But maybe you could improve it by not necessarily removing the grazing altogether, because it needs some, although it may have enough actually from the rabbits sometimes. But it might be that the times of year you could do it a little bit more sensitively, and you could certainly say, let's bring the stock right down. Maybe even let's think about some. The area here is not big enough to make it viable, but some, using a rare breed or something like that, a very low stocking rate. And again, that's hardly worth. It's not worth it economically for the farmer unless the agri-environment scheme plugs the gap in income. Does that make sense? But you know, these are quite difficult decisions, and it's not as though that you can just go onto a site if you're an agri-environment advisor and open the book and say, oh yes, this should be this, go for it. You know, you're going to have to make those choices and try weighing up some of those things if you like to be involved in that debate. Anyway, so here we are on a low intensity, or not, unimproved grassland. Few species.
Yeah, okay, well first of all, I mean, Dave's talked a little bit about the fact that, you know, the nutrients are leaching down, but yet you've got, you know, it's got good other abiotic factors like sunshine because of the way it's facing southeast. Okay, but obviously it is nutrient poor, and you've got a lot of grazing. All right. So if you remember from those excellent lectures you had at the very beginning of your first year on Introduction to Biology.
Didn't get any excellent ones at the beginning.
Yeah, rosette growth habits, low prostrate growth habits, anything that can survive grazing by having a big taproot, like plantain or dandelion, and can grow out very, very low to the ground. It's not going to get damaged by herbivory. So you've got plants like that. We've got ragwort, not this tall like you saw in the sand dunes, but here, growing right close to the ground. Dandelion, be careful with dandelion. You have got dandelion without any.
It can make you wet the bed.
Any leaves, without any hairs on its leaves. You've also got hairy hawkbit or just hawkbit, okay, which has got hairs on its leaves. Looks exactly the same as dandelion leaf. You've got things like yarrow. Again, all of these are important especially yarrow are important indicator species. You've also got clover here, don't forget, but you've also got a very, very delicate plant that looks exactly like clover, but it's got a little sort of like a indent at the end of its leaves, and that's bird's foot trefoil. Okay, it's another nitrogen fixer, same family, but be very bird's foot trefoil. But be very careful you don't just call that.
And
clover.
another very, very important butterfly.
Now the grasses are even harder here now. You've got two types of fescue here. If you've got these are like brushes, like an individual hair from a brush. If you've got them when they curve round like that, slightly, that's sheep's fescue. If they're just growing straight out like that, they are fine-leaved fescue.